Let me introduce my guest on the line with us. Ruth Wasserman Lande is a former MK and former Israeli diplomatic envoy to Egypt. Good evening to you, Ruth. And you just saw him there, Richard Kemp. Colonel Richard Kemp is a former officer in the British Army. He served in Afghanistan. Thank you for being with us as well. Welcome to you both. And Richard, I'll start with you if I may. So it seems that the strategy of the IDF right now is to, after 3 weeks of airstrikes, they're going in bit by bit and they're conquering kind of incremental parts of the territory in northern Gaza, parts of that territory now under IDF control.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be quite a tough fight, although I'm sure that the IDF have destroyed a huge amount of Hamas infrastructure and fighters from the air, which obviously makes it easier, but nevertheless it's going to be a tough fight for the IDF on the ground to clear away and destroy those people who have survived the IDF airstrikes from Hamas.
Let's bring in Ruth. Ruth, welcome. I mean, Israel has a tough fight on its hand, a terrorist group that has embedded itself with the civilian population, tunnels to deal with, who knows what military challenges. On top of that, you've got diplomatic pressure that no other country on earth has to deal with. Huge marches all around the world and calls for Israel to give up and impose a ceasefire.
Israel is facing a huge challenge indeed. But something has happened on October 7th, Laura, that has, I think, makes Israel something in a status that has never been before. Israel will not be the same. Red lines have been crossed to a degree that I think the entire country is, in a sense, in a kind of a shock from the heinous crimes that were perpetrated. And we understand that if we do not deal in a very different way with this enemy, Israel cannot continue in the same manner that it has until now. Now, obviously, the enemy is, as you had said, rightly embedded in the Palestinian civilian population. Very ironically, very cynically, very inhumanely, they prevent some 250,000 civilians, Palestinian civilians, from actually moving southwards, as the IDF has requested, in order to save them, because they need them as human shields, which makes our task so much more difficult. But there is humanity amidst the IDF that will allow them to try as much as possible to take care to hurt the terrorists rather than civilian population. However, given the embedding of the Hamas in the civilian population, there will be more civilian lives lost. And this is a tragedy, but a tragedy that needs to be addressed by the terrorist organization. I dare say that we do not have an easy time, as you had also pointed out, on the international arena, but we simply have no choice. It's a matter of our existence, the welfare of our own citizens, not to mention the fact that there are 230 civilian hostages, amongst them children and the elderly, that are still held in captivity underground by these terrorists.
All right, thank you.
It's beyond me to understand how the world cannot see the terrorism in and within inherent in this act.
And Richard, you've written a piece about this today in the British newspaper The Sun about how this is integral to Hamas's strategy. It wants as many civilians on its side as possible to be killed.
Yeah, I mean, before I answer that, I'd like to agree with Ruth, what she said about the fact that Israel has no choice in this, and those people who are calling on, including the United Nations General Assembly, calling on Israel for a ceasefire, effectively they're saying Israel should not defend itself, it should withdraw back into behind the border and let Hamas get on with what it's doing. That's what it's all about. Israel has no choice but to deal with this problem that it faces. And Hamas, people talk about human shields. I don't see them as human shields. I think they're human sacrifices by Hamas, because Hamas's entire strategy is based on carrying out attacks against Israel, which in turn force Israel to deal with the problem as they are now, and knowing that if they do, Palestinian civilians will die. It's the only army, I wouldn't call Hamas an army, but in loose terms, it's the only army in history that has wanted its enemy to kill its own civilian population, the reason being so that it can see Israel delegitimized, vilified, isolated. And it works every time. And you get these, excuse my language, you get these idiot politicians and other commentators who accuse Israel of committing war crimes against humanity.
Disproportionate response.
Yeah, you've heard it all. I mean, we've all heard it all, and it's just nonsense, either by people who don't understand warfare or who deliberately want to misrepresent Israel's position.
And I wonder if you see any parallels with the war in Afghanistan and the international coalition there, particularly on the issue of aid. I mean, is it possible to deliver aid to civilians when there isn't a ceasefire in place? And was there a similar strategy by the Taliban to embed itself within civilians and make sure that there were civilian casualties, or was it completely different?
No, there were a lot of similarities between the way that the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State fought to the way that Hamas fight. In terms of delivering aid, I don't think it's very easy to get aid into these communities in Gaza when you recognise, as I certainly recognise, and most people do, certainly in Israel, that the Hamas will hijack as much of the aid as possible and use it for their own resources. So I think as long as it's controlled and limited, it is possible in some circumstances. And in terms of human shields, I don't remember that the Taliban, or indeed the other terrorist groups that I was involved with fighting, deliberately tried to get us to kill their civilian population. They did embed themselves in it, but I think that was more for their own protection, because there wasn't really the same international campaign against the West fighting in Afghanistan as there is against Israel fighting in Gaza.
Right.
So it wasn't quite the same, but there was, yes, human shields, lots of positioning of weapons and munitions, fighters and military facilities in schools, hospitals, mosques, just exactly like the Taliban, the Hamas are doing in Gaza.
And Ruth, how can Israel, operate when it has this level of diplomatic pressure on its shoulders? For now, Israel's allies, the United States, we know that President Biden will be speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu tonight. For now, the United States is sticking firmly by Israel's side. The Europeans, less so, but there is a window that world sympathy will inevitably run out, won't it?
Well, the thing is that we need to make evident to the world what is very, very clear to us. The instigation of these demonstrations throughout the world is as the entire roadmap of this so-called attack is run by the mastermind Iran. And it too is the one that stands behind instigating all those so-called spontaneous demonstrations throughout the world. And the pressure, of course, Qatar has a hand in that as well, funding a lot of the campuses and the universities that are giving a platform to this anti-Israeli rhetoric. I'm not saying that there are no spontaneous antagonism, but it is measured in ratio to the one that is instigated and incited by Iran and its co-workers. We need to make clear to the world that this is not a local skirmish. This is not a war between Israel and Gaza. This is an Iranian-led, instigated, funded, trained effort to undermine, together with other factors in the international arena, undermine a different axis, an axis that we want to be a part of, including the UK and France and Italy and Germany and European powers. We need to open our eyes to what is really happening here. And what is happening here has very little to do with Israel. We are talking about occupation. What occupation. Since 2005, there is no occupation of one single Israeli. In fact, we dug out the graves from Gaza and imported them back to the undisputed part of Israel. There is not one bone of anybody left in Gaza. There is no occupation. This is something that is very, I would say, orchestrated by a certain planned, by the way, meticulously planned, masterminded issue to undermine the Western world. And there are reasons for that. We can go into it, we don't have to go into it, but this is something that requires an international coalition, an international coalition by those countries that seek stability, that seek a sane world, and they include the European countries. We need to make them understand.
Okay.
Because it's just a matter of time until it happens there as well.
And just quickly, Richard Kemp, I mean, do you think there is a kind of a weariness in Europe and possibly in the United States as well with the, wars in the Middle East, the fight against ISIS, Daesh? They simply don't want to have to deal with this problem again.
There's also a war weariness in Europe with what's going on in Ukraine, which has been on everybody's screens and grabbing everyone's attention for a long time. So, yeah, I think that's right. And I think one thing we should be very aware of, all eyes are rightly now on what's happening here. But these demonstrations that we were talking about, these protests, they are terrorizing the Jewish communities in Europe and in the United States. And they're aimed, of course, to do that. The protests aren't particularly aimed at Israel. They're aimed at the Jewish diaspora in order to try and force them to remove their support from Israel, because they recognize that the strongest support for Israel outside of Israel is the Jews in places like Europe and the United States. And that's what those protests and the Iranian orchestrated protest campaign that Ruth spoke about is all about.
All right. Thank you, Richard.